Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to get complex sources, well, broken down into something clear and useful.
Right. We take that stack of info and try to pull out the key insights for you.
And today, you've given us a really fascinating one, the ISIS Papers by Dr. Frances Cress Welsing.
Yeah, we looked at some audiobook excerpts focusing on her core concept, the color confrontation theory.
It's definitely thought-provoking stuff. We should probably say up front, these are challenging perspectives.
Absolutely. Our goal here isn't to agree or disagree, but just to understand the arguments Welsing is making in the source material itself.
Exactly. So the mission for you listening is to really get a handle on what this color confrontation theory is and how she uses it as a framework to understand, well, social dynamics.
Okay, so where do we start? The foundation seems to be her view on white supremacy.
Yeah, it's central. She sees it not just as, individual bias or prejudice.
Right, but as a whole system, a global system of domination run by people who classify themselves as white.
And she pulls in Neely Fuller Jr.'s idea here too, doesn't she?
Uh-huh. Fuller framing race itself as a kind of organization set up specifically to maintain white dominance.
It makes you think of W.E.B. Du Bois too, his whole problem of the color line from way back. She sees that as an early signpost.
Exactly. A key takeaway here is that the theory isn't looking at racism as random acts, but as a structured, purposeful system.
And a persistent one, according to her.
Hmm.
Like, it's been going for centuries and just keeps adapting.
Yeah, despite efforts to dismantle it. And this is where her background really comes in, isn't it, as a psychiatrist?
Right. She's looking at the why, the motivations, individual and group level, that keep this system running across everything. Economics, education, religion.
Culture, yeah, all of it. And she highlights Fuller's pretty direct statement.
The one about hate.
Yeah, that most white people hate black people fundamentally because whites are not black people. It sounds stark, but...
But for the theory, understanding the core distinction is apparently crucial to interpret everything else.
Right. Fuller suggests you'll misread things otherwise.
Okay, so we have this system, this core distinction, and that leads into her main concept, color confrontation.
Exactly. She links what she calls a neurotic drive for superiority back to something deeper.
Which is?
A deep and pervading sense of inadequacy and inferiority. It's counterintuitive, maybe.
And this is where skin color becomes really specific in the theory.
Very specific. She starts with demographics. White people are a global minority.
Okay.
But the key step is how she defines whiteness. Not just as a skin color, but as the absence of any ability to produce color.
Right, the lack of melanin.
Uh-huh. And she interprets that biological fact as a genetic inadequacy or relative genetic deficiency.
So it's framing a biological difference as a kind of lack.
Precisely. And that perceived lack becomes a cornerstone for understanding power dynamics in her view.
And she kind of flips the script on what's normal, doesn't she?
She really does, arguing that since most people globally have color, that's the norm for humans. Color absence is the abnormality.
And genetically, color is dominant. Black people having the greatest color potential, as she puts it.
So all of that builds towards the color confrontation theory itself.
Which is?
The idea that when white Europeans first encountered large populations of colored peoples, it triggered something deep.
Not just curiosity.
No, a profound sense of numerical inadequacy and color inferiority. A psychological shock, almost.
A confrontation with their own difference on a massive scale.
Exactly. And the reaction, according to Welsing, was defensive.
Leading to?
An uncontrollable sense of hostility and aggression. She argues this initial aggression came from whites.
And non-whites were then just reacting to the situation.
Often just responding to the already established social conditions of white supremacy. She even mentions that idea of identifying with the oppressor.
Okay, so how does this theory explain the mechanisms of the system? The behaviors?
Well, it suggests many are defense mechanisms,
Yeah.
things to cope with that initial color confrontation.
Like the idea of white genetic superiority.
Right. She sees that myth not as a genuine belief, but as a complex psychological defense against the awareness of having, in her terms, inferior color production.
So creating a story to counter an underlying feeling.
Pretty much. And then there's projection.
How does that work here?
She argues whites feel this hostility towards non-whites, but then project it outwards, claiming they are the ones being hated.
Which lets them off the hook, psychologically.
It helps mitigate guilt, yeah. Makes their own aggression feel justified, perhaps.
And what about sexuality in this theory? It seems to come up a lot.
It does. She looks at the historic and continuing desire of whites for sexual alliances with non-whites.
And she doesn't just see that as attraction.
Not primarily. She links it to an unconscious desire maybe to connect with color production, like vicariously accessing it.
Because they can't produce it themselves, in her view.
Right. Seeking partners who can becomes a way to address that perceived lack.
Which then explains the intense reactions, historically, to black male-white female relationships.
That's the argument. The white male in this framework feels threatened by the black male's perceived ability to give the white female colored offspring, highlighting his own perceived inadequacy. It's color envy, as she calls it.
Wow. Does she give examples?
She does. She points to Malcolm X's autobiography, where he talked about white men asking him to be with white women while they watched.
Seriously?
Yeah. Welsing interprets that not just as a fetish, but as white men wanting to somehow identify with the black male's perceived ability to produce color.
And she takes this analysis into some really dark places, too, like lynchings.
Right. Specifically, the focus on castration, the targeting of testicles.
Why that specific focus?
Her argument is it was a symbolic attack on the powerful color-producing genetic material. Not just violence, but targeting the perceived source of genetic strength.
And the obsession with penis size.
She sees that as a displacement. The real issue, the color envy, is too deep, maybe too repressed to confront directly.
So the focus shifts to the penis as a symbol.
Exactly. A more tangible, if still symbolic, battleground.
And the way sex itself is often treated in the culture, kind of degraded or overly sexualized.
She links that back to self-alienation, alienation from their own perceived colorlessness, and inability to produce color through sex.
Contrasting it with cultures where reproduction is highly valued.
Yeah. She even mentions white writers expressing a profound sense of self-alienation.
What about things like counterculture movements? Hippies, for instance.
She has an interpretation for that, too. Their embrace of, dirt, naturalism, adding color to clothes and art.
An attempt to counter colorlessness.
Possibly an unconscious one, yeah. Even things like tanning.
Trying to get color.
Right. A sort of frantic but ultimately futile attempt, in her view, to resolve that alienation.
Okay, so we have the psychological drivers.
Yeah.
What about the bigger picture? Social and global effects.
Well, if racism starts with self-alienation, it naturally extends to alienation from others.
So global conflicts.
She sees them as reflections, external projections of that inner conflict, that self-rejection based on color inadequacy.
That's a big claim, interpreting geopolitics through that lens.
It is, and even things like segregation in housing or schools.
Not just discrimination, but
Also a psychological discomfort. Whites avoiding the constant daily confrontation with their own perceived color inadequacy when around people of color.
and she argues that real equality explodes the myth of white superiority.
Precisely. So resistance to equality isn't coming from actual superiority, but from that fundamental sense of being unequal regarding color and being a numerical minority.
Which ties into the drive for
Yeah.
what? Material wealth, power, technology.
She sees those as compensatory behaviors, responses to that core psychological inadequacy, the melanin thing, not, say, Adler's ideas about infant size.
And the focus on numbers. The global minority status.
Yeah, that vulnerability leads to strategies, she argues, like dividing non-white groups against each other.
To make them seem like the minorities.
Right. Manipulating the narrative. So whites feel like the majority, even when they aren't globally.
And things like population control, targeting non-whites.
Fits the pattern, in her theory. A conscious or unconscious move related to that awareness of white numerical deficiency. You don't see the same pressure on white birth rates.
Okay, now she makes a pretty specific claim about the origin of white skin itself.
She does. It's probably one of the most controversial parts. She states flatly that white skin is a form of albinism.
Based on microscopic similarity.
That's her assertion, and from that, she builds an origin story.
Which is?
That the first white-skinned people were albino mutants born to black parents in Africa.
And they were rejected.
Rejected, cast out, which she interprets as a kind of prehistoric parental abuse or rejection.
And then they migrated north.
Migrated north to survive, away from the strong sun, ending up in Europe.
Does she cite anyone on this?
She references Schopenhauer's comments about white skin not being natural, looking bleached, and Dr. Cheek Antediop's research stating the appearance of the white race relatively recently due to depigmentation.
And this origin story connects to cultural myths.
She links it to things like Adam and Eve, the nakedness, the shame connecting it symbolically to the appearance of whiteness.
Let's talk more about the symbolism she finds everywhere. Mark Twain.
Yeah, she points out how Twain often described white skin as sort of lacking beauty, looking washed out next to darker skin.
In Tarzan. That's a big one for her.
Huge. The white baby, raised by black apes, returns to dominate. She highlights that the name Tarzan apparently meant white skin in the fictional ape language.
And Tarzan feeling embarrassed about his skin, wanting a tan.
She connects that right back to the white collective's preoccupation with color, that subconscious desire for melanin.
Okay, the Christian cross symbolism is intense.
It is. She calls it a brain-computer distillate, like a condensed symbol from the white collective unconscious.
Representing what exactly?
An obsession with non-white, especially black male genitals. She argues the cross symbolizes castrated genitals linked to early aggression and anxiety,
And the sword shape mirroring it.
part of the same symbolic cluster, in her view.
Wow. And this symbolic reading extends to chocolate.
Heart-shaped chocolates, things like that, symbolic sperm packages of black genetic material desired by white females.
Even coaching sports.
White coaches telling black players to put dark balls in white nets. Same underlying symbolism, she argues.
And black lingerie on white men.
Symbolic desire for the black female. It's a whole symbolic universe she's decoding.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. She addresses what she sees as rising issues in the black community: passivity, homosexuality.
Yeah, she frames this as a serious problem, an epidemic proportion, specifically within the context of white supremacy.
How does she define black mental health in this context?
As behavior that supports the self and the group under white supremacy. Resisting negation, resisting destruction. She feels Freudian ideas aren't sufficient here.
So passivity or homosexuality aren't just choices, but
Potential adaptations or solutions, functional or dysfunctional, to the extreme pressures of the racist system.
why would they be adaptations?
Because, the theory goes, white survival depends on controlling non-white men, especially black men, because of the melanin potential, the perceived genetic threat.
So historical tactics like castration, lynching,
Yeah.
and ongoing subtle abuse.
All aimed at forcing submission. She talks about the non-white survival unit instead of family, arguing its development is deliberately stunted.
And denying black men economic power.
Leads to a loss of respect for manhood within the community itself.
What about hypersexuality during slavery?
She suggests it might have been one of the few outlets for expressing manhood then, but now diminished by birth control pressures.
Leading to more female-headed households.
Linked to lack of male roles, economic factors, maybe welfare dynamics, which then impacts role models for kids.
And this leads back to passivity or homosexuality. How?
As a long-run byproduct, she suggests, of submitting to the fear of white male power, internalizing that fear.
That's a strong claim.
Very. She even suggests white society might condone homosexuality partly as a strategy to weaken black communities. Her solution involves confronting that fear directly, raising sons to be protectors.
And white male homosexuality.
She speculates it might lead to attempts to compensate by exerting influence over non-whites. It's complex.
Okay, what about Freud's penis envy? She reinterprets that too.
She does. Starts by saying every system has a goal here. It's white supremacy. And links Semite identity historically to African descent and melanin.
So penis envy isn't really the girl wanting a penis.
Not primarily in her view. It's the white male's envy of the black penis and the genetic, color-producing power it symbolizes for him.
And white males project their inadequacy onto white females.
That's the idea. Creating a secondary penis envy in women rooted in the male fear of competition from black men.
Okay, back to symbols. Weapons, guns.
The gun is a critical symbol, she says. Defense against that deep genetic vulnerability.
Tying back to the degraded view of sex.
Yeah, because sex produces the white, pale, genetically vulnerable self, as she puts it, referencing Twain again.
So a perceived inferiority in genitalia.
Especially white male compared to black male. She mentions Dr. Keeler's observations about albinism possibly linking to some physical differences.
And weapons become the equalizer.
The great equalizer, yeah. Developed out of fear of genetic annihilation to match the perceived power of the black male's genital apparatus. Even the Englishman's umbrella gets interpreted.
As a phallic symbol of control.
Control over non-white reproduction. She analyzes a murder case through this lens, too, gun violence, as a response to feeling genitally inadequate or rejected.
What about the term motherfucker?
She gives that a really specific layered meaning. Notes its common use by black males, suggesting powerlessness relative to white males.
But its origin, she thinks, lies elsewhere.
In the psyche of white supremacy organizers, specifically the white male. Again, linking back to the white as albino mutant from Black origins idea.
So the word reflects black male pain.
But originates from the white male context. How? She connects it to historical white male sexual use of black females, the symbolic black mother, links it to Oedipus sleeping with the mother, slaying the father figure, and Adam and Eve again.
The white male desire is to be born again without the defect.
Symbolically, yes, through the black female, tying into Christian born-again concepts and original sin being the sex that produces whiteness.
But they also degrade black women.
Out of fear of genetic annihilation and anger at the symbolic mother for their albinism. So the word means imposed powerlessness for black men, but unthinkable genetic powerlessness for white men.
Wow. Okay, even ball games.
Symbolic war of the balls, she calls it, reflecting white admiration and fear of black testicles versus contempt for their own.
All tied to genetic survival.
Preoccupation with genes, genitalia, survival. Rules change, but the real game, world domination, stays the same. Symbolism reveals the truth.
So ball games equal race war, essentially.
War of the testicles, race war, yeah. In her symbolic reading.
And smoking.
Another phallic symbol. White male asserting power, virility, compensating for genital inadequacy feelings.
Putting it in the mouth is symbolic, too.
Linked to fellatio, yes. Its global prevalence shows the power of this unconscious drive. White women smoking is emulating male power.
Okay, let's talk about fear in the black community. She acknowledges it's real.
Absolutely. A real response to a real threat. But she's critical of certain responses.
Yeah.
Escapism, maybe some forms of interracial marriage historically, embracing Marxism, seeing them as ways to avoid confronting white supremacy head-on.
She criticizes Marx directly.
Yeah, for not analyzing the anti-Semitism his own group faced under white supremacy, argues class is about power, and all non-whites are powerless victims in this system, regardless of income.
So the first step is admitting the fear.
Admitting the fear of dying while fighting, yeah. To develop clear analysis, self-respect, and independent black solutions. Stop avoiding the core issue.
What about God? The concept, the image.
Well, most people believe in God. Kids are taught early. But the image matters.
The white God and Jesus images.
She says they constantly reinforce white superiority, black inferiority, but notes the symbolism of black robes for judges, priests. Maybe an unconscious link of black to wisdom, justice.
Her advice?
Consciously remove the white image. See your own body as the connection to the God force. Believing God is white is ultimate self-negation for black people. Breaking that is key to liberation.
Rape is another heavy topic she analyzes.
Yeah, calls it sick behavior, low self-respect, notes its frequency and confinement, frames it within the white power versus non-white powerlessness dynamic.
Bringing it back to the core theory.
Right. White numerical minority, genetic recessiveness, fears driving the system to avoid annihilation, weapons shipped like genitals.
The gun is equalizer, the arms race.
All linked. Blackballing, linked to fear of black genitals annihilating white genetics. Contradictory messages to white women fear black men, but desire tall, dark, handsome.
She sees the focus on anti-rape campaigns as projection.
Potentially, yeah. Ultimately views rape as a symptom of sensed male inadequacy within the whole system.
How does she address justifiable homicide?
Starts with Proverbs, no vision, people perish. Urges black people. Overcome fear, think critically, analyze, plan, develop self-respect, stop distractions, focus on the war against them.
Connecting current police shootings to history.
To the lynching of Jesus, a black male killed by Romans, in her view, argues white vulnerability, economic issues, lost wars, leads to more killing of non-white males.
And it's framed as justified.
Within the logic of fearing white genetic annihilation, says all whites have a mandate for white genetic survival, including killing non-white males when necessary. Black males face the most ferocity.
Even hunting gets pulled in.
Hunting dark animals as psychological prep for killing non-white males. Driven by unconscious factors, unlike hunting for food. More hunting enthusiasm equals more justifiable homicide.
She points out political paradoxes, too.
Yeah, U.S. bailing out white communist countries while black U.S. males face violence and unemployment. Shows white solidarity trumps economics. White Cubans welcomed, black Haitians rejected, non-whites are the real enemy.
And justifiable homicide isn't just physical killing.
No, includes subtle stuff. Denying jobs, undermining families, promoting homosexuality, drugs, points to single-parent family rates, critiques media portrayals.
All serving to neutralize black male power for white genetic survival.
That's the argument. And whites won't stop, so blacks and non-whites must understand the war and evolve counter-strategies. Educate kids, Pressure men to be husbands, fathers, fight for jobs, women be discerning.
So wrapping up, we've covered a lot. The color confrontation theory, white supremacy is rooted in genetic insecurity, all the symbolism.
It's definitely a dense and, yeah, challenging perspective from Welsing's work.
Important for listeners, we think, just to sit with these ideas. Consider how this framework might or might not offer a lens on social dynamics.
Right. Regardless of whether you ultimately agree with it, grappling with the analysis itself can be insightful.
And if this sparked your interest, obviously diving into the ISIS papers itself or related critical theories would be the next step.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thing to think about. How does trying to understand underlying motivations, even really uncomfortable ones like those proposed here, potentially give us new ways to look at problems that just seem to persist?
Something to chew on. That's our deep dive for today. Thanks for tuning in.